The whole town of Cassidy Flats knew that Inez Pritchard's laugh was the most dangerous sound in Collin County, Texas, because it had broken more men's hearts than a drought had broken homesteads. And on the morning that Joseph Hadley rode into town with nothing but a worn saddle, a sorrel horse, and the particular brand of quiet confidence that comes from a man who has learned to expect very little from the world, not a single soul thought to warn him. It was the spring of 1878, and Cassidy Flats was the kind of town that had grown up sideways. A general store, a livery, a saloon called the Painted Rooster, a church whose steeple leaned northward as if listening for something it had never quite heard, and a post office that doubled as the office of one Deputy Earl Sutter, who was more interested in the price of beef than in the law. The Texas panhandle spread out around the town like a great tawny blanket, interrupted only by the occasional cedar and the thin silver thread of Crooked Creek to the east. It was beautiful in the way that hard things are beautiful, not soft or inviting, but enormous and honest. Inez Pritchard owned the town's only bakery, which also served as a lunch counter 3 days a week, and which smelled on every morning of its operation like warm bread and dried apples and the faint ghost of cinnamon. She was 32 years old, which the town's older women considered a tragedy, and which Inez herself considered a fact, like the color of the sky or the direction of the wind. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely at the back of her head during business hours, and that she let fall to her shoulders on Sunday mornings when she swept her front porch. Her eyes were the color of strong coffee, and they had a way of looking at a person that made the person feel both seen and slightly accountable. She had a wide, lovely mouth that was equally capable of great warmth and great severity, and which she deployed with the practiced ease of a woman who had survived a great deal and intended to survive a great deal more. She had been married once to Thomas Pritchard, a cattle broker from Abilene who had been kind and steady and unremarkable in the way that a good fence post is unremarkable, reliable, useful, not particularly beautiful, and deeply missed when it was gone. Thomas had died of a fever in the autumn of 1871, 2 years into their marriage, leaving Inez with a small savings, a recipe box full of her mother's handwriting, and the bakery building which had been Thomas's wedding gift to her. She had been 25 years old, and she had grieved genuinely and completely, and then she had gotten up and made bread. In the 7 years since Thomas's death, she had received 11 proposals of marriage. 11. She knew the number precisely because she kept them in her mind the way a careful woman keeps accounts, not out of vanity, but out of a desire to understand the mathematics of her own life. The first had come from Barlow Kent, the feed store owner, 4 months after Thomas died, and it had been so aggressively premature that she had laughed before she could stop herself, a single sharp laugh that had echoed off the walls of the feed store and sent Barlow's cat scrambling under the counter. Barlow had never quite forgiven her, though he still bought his sugar at her counter. After that first laugh, the laughing had become, if not deliberate, then at least predictable. When Roy Alderman, the circuit preacher, had proposed in a letter that was so full of scripture it barely contained a proposal at all, she had read it twice at her kitchen table, begun composing a polite refusal in her head, and then laughed so suddenly and so completely that she had spilled her coffee. When Pete Hollis had gone down on one knee in the middle of the Painted Rooster, a gesture that was clearly meant to be romantic, but was undermined by the fact that he had done it in front of 7 spectators and a dog. She had pressed both hands to her mouth and still laughed straight through them. When old Miles Decker had proposed with the practical observation that they were both getting on in years and might as well get on together, she had given him a long, considering look, and then laughed so warmly and so genuinely that he had laughed with her, and they had parted on excellent terms. The men of Cassidy Flats and the surrounding county had, by the spring of 1878, developed something between a superstition and a sport about Inez Pritchard's laugh. Younger men who were new to the area would sometimes be dared into proposing to her, not because anyone expected success, but because there was a general and slightly shameful understanding that her laugh was, in its way, a kind of gift, that being laughed at by Inez Pritchard was still better than being accepted by most other women, because at least you had made her happy for a moment. Inez herself was not entirely unaware of this dynamic, and it annoyed her in the specific way that things annoy a person when they understand how they have contributed to the problem. She did not want to be alone forever. She was honest enough to acknowledge that to herself, on the quiet mornings when the bread was rising and the town was still sleeping, and the light came through her front window in long amber columns. She wanted to be known by someone. She wanted to argue about small things and be right half the time. She wanted someone to hand her coffee to in the mornings and to find in the evening, sitting in the other chair on her porch. She wanted that ordinary, enormous, irreplaceable thing that people called companionship. But she had also discovered, through 11 careful examinations of the subject, that what she did not want was to be proposed to by a man who was proposing an arrangement rather than a life, and that was what 11 men had offered her, in 11 different ways, all dressed up in varying degrees of sentiment. Joseph Hadley arrived on a Wednesday in April, which was the day Inez made her apple turnovers. He came in off the main road leading his sorrel horse, whose name was Captain, by the bridle, because the horse had thrown a shoe somewhere between the Barker ranch and town, and Joseph was not the kind of man to ride an animal that was suffering even a small discomfort. He was 34 years old, tall and lean in a way that suggested he had worked hard for a long time, with dark hair that had grown out past the point of intentional style and was currently doing something independent along his collar. He had a straight nose, a jaw that looked like it had been squared off with a carpenter's tool, and a pair of gray eyes that were, in the opinion of nearly everyone who later tried to describe them, very calm, not cold, not distant, calm. There was a considerable difference. He tied Captain to the post outside the livery and went inside, and the conversation he had with old Bert Kessler, the liveryman, lasted about 8 minutes and consisted primarily of arrangements for the horse's shoe and the question of whether there was a boarding house in town. There was not a boarding house. There was, however, a room above the saddle shop that Walt Grayson sometimes rented out, and Walt Grayson was a fair man, so Joseph thanked Bert, collected his saddlebag, and walked up the main street of Cassidy Flats to find Walt Grayson. He passed the bakery on his way, and the smell of the apple turnovers hit him at about the same moment that Inez Pritchard pushed open her front door to hang the hand-lettered sign that said "Open" on its nail, and they nearly collided, and Joseph stepped back and said, "Pardon me, ma'am," with such immediate and genuine attention to the space between them that Inez blinked. Most men, when they nearly collided with her, either overcorrected into elaborate apology or minimized the incident entirely. Joseph Hadley simply stepped back and said exactly what was needed and nothing more, and then he looked at her with those calm gray eyes and waited. "No harm done," she said, because there wasn't. He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, a gesture that was not performed but was simply a habit, which she noticed, and continued up the street. She watched him go for exactly 3 seconds before she turned back to her bakery, and she did not think about him again until that afternoon, when he came back in and asked for 2 turnovers and a cup of coffee, and paid with exact coin, and sat at the small table by the window and ate quietly, and looked out at the street in the manner of a man who is comfortable with silence. "You're new," she said, not because it was particularly necessary to say, but because she was curious and she had learned to trust her curiosity. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Joseph Hadley, I've taken the room above Grayson's saddle shop." "Inez Pritchard," she said, "you passing through or staying?" "Staying," he said. "For a while at least. I'm looking for work. I heard the Barker ranch might be hiring." "Barker's always hiring," she said. "He keeps more land than hands." Joseph nodded and took another bite of the turnover, and she thought she saw something shift in his expression that might have been pleasure, though it was restrained enough that she could not be certain. "These are very good," he said. It was not flattery. It was an observation delivered with the same directness he brought to everything else, and something about that particular quality of honesty made Inez, who had been complimented on her baking by 11 men with ulterior motives, feel unexpectedly warm. "Thank you," she said, and went back to her counter. He did not propose that day. He did not say anything further, in fact, beyond asking for a second cup of coffee and thanking her when she brought it. He finished, placed his cup carefully on the table, settled his hat, and left, and Inez found herself watching the door for a moment after it closed, which was unusual enough that she noted it and filed it away somewhere she was not entirely sure about. He got the job at the Barker Ranch, as it turned out, because Sam Barker was not a complicated man, and Joseph Hadley came with skills. He could read land. He could manage cattle without the particular violence that some cowboys considered efficient, and he could fix a fence line in the time it took most men to assess the problem. He started riding out to the ranch on Monday mornings and riding back into town on Saturday evenings, and somewhere in the second week of this arrangement, it became a habit for him to stop at Inez's bakery on Saturday evening before she closed up, partly because the apple turnovers were genuinely the best thing he had eaten since leaving Missouri 8 months ago, and partly because the bakery was warm and the company was honest, and those two qualities were, for Joseph Hadley, always in short supply. Inez noticed the pattern before he was through his third Saturday visit. She noticed because she was, by nature and by the education of her experience, a woman who noticed things. She also noticed that he never lingered beyond the natural end of a conversation, that he never steered the talk toward personal territory without an invitation, and that he had opinions, real ones, not performed for her benefit, about things like rainfall and the price of beef, and whether the Reconstruction government in Austin was serving anyone's interests honestly, which in 1878 was a genuinely complicated question that most people in the county were exhausted by, but which Inez had her own considered views on. "You think the land grants have been handled fairly?" she asked one Saturday evening in May, when they had somehow moved from the subject of the county cattle drive to the subject of land administration, a migration in conversation that neither of them had planned but both of them had been interested enough to follow. "No," he said flatly. "The Comanche and the Kiowa have been pushed off land they had rights to by any honest measure, and what's been done since the treaty at Medicine Lodge has been—" he paused, choosing words with care, convenient for certain people and catastrophic for others. "And the people it was catastrophic for don't have anyone in Austin arguing their side." Inez studied him. "That's a bold opinion for a man who works for a rancher." "Sam Barker's a decent man," Joseph said. "Doesn't mean every man who profits from the expansion of the cattle range deserves the profit." She set down her dish towel and looked at him properly. "You are not," she said slowly, "what I expected when you walked through my door in April." "What did you expect?" he asked. "I'm not entirely sure," she said honestly. "Something less complicated." He smiled at that, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and it changed the whole geography of his face in a way that startled her, because she had thought she had a clear picture of what he looked like, and apparently she had been missing something important. The smile reached his eyes and involved a small crease at the left corner of his mouth and made him look, for a moment, younger than 34 and considerably more dangerous than she had previously assessed. "I'll try to be more straightforward," he said, in a tone that indicated he had no intention of doing any such thing, and she laughed, not the practiced laugh of a woman deflecting a man's intentions, but a real laugh, sudden and warm, and it surprised them both. He left shortly after, and she stood at her window and watched him go up the street, and she thought with a particular kind of wariness that this man was going to cause her some trouble. The summer came on hard, as summers do in the Texas Panhandle, all white heat and windless days and the particular smell of dry grass baking in the afternoon sun. Inez kept the bakery cooler by opening both the back door and the front window before dawn and closing everything at noon, which meant she was baking through the small hours of the morning and finished before the worst of the heat, a schedule that she had perfected over years and that she explained to no one because it was simply how she operated. Joseph had taken to leaving Captain at the livery on Saturday nights and riding out to the Barker Ranch on Sunday morning instead of Saturday evening, which added one more day in town, and which he described to Bert Kessler as a practical matter of resting the horse. Bert Kessler, who had been watching Cassidy Flats for 30 years and had an excellent sense for the actual reasons behind things, said nothing except that Captain was welcome and the stall rate was 50 cents a night. The additional evening in town meant that Joseph sometimes appeared at the Painted Rooster on Saturday nights, and it was at the Painted Rooster in early July that the first complication arrived. His name was Frank Delamore, and he was not strictly speaking a bad man, but he was the kind of man who moves through the world in the way that a large object moves through water, displacing everything around him, and not particularly noticing the displacement. He was the brother of a rancher 2 counties over. He had been in Cassidy Flats for a month on business that was never fully specified, and he had proposed to Inez Pritchard 6 weeks after his arrival, which had gotten him laughed at, which had not sat well with him in the way that things don't sit well with men who are not accustomed to women having opinions about them. On that Saturday evening in July, Inez had come into the Painted Rooster to deliver a pie to the owner, Jack Halliwell, who had a standing order every other Saturday, and Frank Delamore was at the bar and had had 3 glasses of whiskey, which was enough to make him larger than he already was. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, as she came through the door. He said it the way men say a woman's name when they mean something other than the name. Inez set her pie on the bar and looked at him with the particular expression she had developed for exactly this kind of encounter, which was calm and direct and communicated without words that she was not interested in whatever was coming. "Frank," she said by way of acknowledgement, and turned to Jack Halliwell. "You know what I think," Frank said to the room in general. "I think Mrs. Pritchard is too fine a woman to be running a bakery by herself. I think she needs someone to look after her." "I've been looking after myself for 7 years," Inez said, still addressing Jack Halliwell. "I've become rather good at it." "A woman alone is a sad thing," Frank said. Inez picked up the coin that Jack Halliwell slid across the bar to her, pocketed it, and turned to face Frank Delamore. "I disagree," she said pleasantly. "Good evening, Frank." She had turned to go when Frank Delamore reached out and closed his hand around her arm, and the room shifted in the specific way that rooms shift when something that is about to become a problem announces itself. Joseph Hadley was at a table near the back with 2 of the Barker Ranch hands, and he was on his feet before he had consciously decided to be, crossing the room with a quiet, even stride that was somehow more alarming than urgency would have been. "Take your hand off her," he said, arriving at Frank Delamore's elbow. His voice was not loud. It was very, very even. Frank Delamore was a big man, and he turned to look at Joseph Hadley with the appraising look of someone who is calculating odds. Joseph Hadley looked back at him with those gray eyes that were utterly, perfectly calm, and Frank Delamore, who had an animal's instinct for the kind of man who means exactly what he says, released Inez's arm. "Mind your business, cowboy," Frank said. "I was minding my pie," Joseph said, which was so entirely unexpected that 2 men at the bar laughed before they could stop themselves. "You made it my business." There was a long moment during which Frank Delamore appeared to be weighing various options, and then he picked up his glass and turned back to the bar, and the room exhaled. Inez walked out of the Painted Rooster without looking at Joseph Hadley because she needed a moment to collect something inside herself that had gone sideways when he had appeared at her elbow, and she was not yet ready to examine what that something was. He caught up with her on the boardwalk, not hurrying, just matching her pace. "I didn't need your help," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Then why did you intervene?" Because he put his hand on you without permission, Joseph said, and I find I am not able to watch that without doing something about it. That's not about your ability to manage yourself. It's about what kind of man I am. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The night was warm and the stars were enormous, and the painted rooster behind them was sending out fiddle music through its thin walls like a small, cheerful signal. That is a very clear answer, she said. I try to be clear, he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then something occurred to her that she ought to have recognized earlier, and it settled over her with the particular weight of things you know before you know them. Joseph, she said carefully, are you courting me? He was quiet for a moment. In the lamplight from the nearest window, she could see that he was considering the question seriously, which was itself an answer. I think I might be, he said. I wasn't sure it was something you would be interested in, so I was trying to be patient about it. Patient, she repeated. You are clearly a woman who makes her own assessments, he said. I didn't think it would be useful to push. Inez Pritchard looked at Joseph Hadley for a long moment, and she felt within herself the curious sensation of standing at the edge of something that she could not yet see the bottom of. I appreciate the patience, she said at last. I'd ask you to continue it. Of course, he said. They stood there for another moment in the warm night, and then she said good night and walked back to her bakery, and she did not laugh because it wasn't funny. It was something else entirely. August arrived with a dry lightning storm that set a grass fire going north of the Barker Ranch, and every man in the county who could hold a shovel spent 3 days working the fire line, including Joseph, who came back to town on the 4th day covered in ash and exhaustion, and the particular satisfaction of having done something real. He had a shallow burn along his left forearm that he had wrapped himself with a strip of his shirt, and Inez, who saw it when he came in for coffee, made him sit down and unwrapped it and rewrapped it properly with the clean linen she kept in the back for kitchen accidents. She worked in silence, and he let her, and the quality of that silence was different from the silence he maintained out of respect for her autonomy or the silence she maintained out of careful assessment. It was the silence of two people who are comfortable enough with each other to not need words as a buffer against proximity. You should have had someone look at this sooner, she said. Wasn't anyone around who knew what they were doing, he said. Does it hurt? Some. He looked at her hands, which were moving with the quick, certain efficiency of a woman who had been doing practical things for a long time. You have a steady hand. I've been making pastry for 15 years, she said. You develop a steady hand. He smiled. She was looking at the bandage and did not see it, but she heard it in his voice when he said, "Thank you, Inez." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she noted it the way she noted all significant things, quietly and with the full weight of her attention. "You're welcome, Joseph," she said. September brought the county fair at the larger town of Marville, 12 miles east, and a considerable portion of Cassidy Flats made the journey by wagon on the first Saturday of the month. It was understood, in the way that things are understood in small towns without being explicitly communicated, that Joseph Hadley and Inez Pritchard were likely to attend the county fair together, or at least in the same general proximity to each other, which amounted to the same thing in the social geography of 1878 Texas. What was less anticipated was that Inez would enter her apple turnovers in the baking competition and win, which she had not won in the previous 3 years because Agnes Barlow, who made a legitimate and formidable cherry preserves cake, had been the judge's consistent preference. The judge this year was a newcomer from San Antonio who had no prior allegiance, and Inez's turnovers won by a considerable margin, and she was standing at the competition table holding the blue ribbon and smiling with the full, unguarded smile that she rarely allowed herself in public when Joseph appeared at her elbow. "You won," he said, with a pleasure in his voice that was entirely for her and not at all for the crowd. "I won," she agreed and looked up at him, and the smile was still there, and for a long, vivid moment neither of them said anything, and the fair moved and rattled and called around them like a bright flood, and they were very still in the middle of it, looking at each other. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said. "Properly. In Marville. There is a dining room at the hotel that I understand serves a reasonable meal." "Tonight," she said. "Tonight," he said. She looked at the blue ribbon in her hand and then at him, and she said, "Yes." The dining room at the Marville Hotel was not, strictly speaking, elegant, but it had tablecloths and candles and a menu written on a small chalkboard, and the food was warm and the wine was reasonable, and the evening was long enough that they had time to get past the careful conversational territory they had been navigating since April and into something deeper. He told her about Missouri. He had grown up there, on a small farm outside a town called Harmony, the second of 4 children, and his father had been a man who worked land he loved and died of a heart attack at 51, which had scattered the family in the way that the death of a center scatters what had been held together around it. His older brother had taken the farm. His 2 younger sisters had married and gone east. He had gone west, which is what men did in 1878 when they did not know what else to do with themselves. "Did you not want the farm?" Inez asked. "I wanted to want it," he said. "But it was my brother's in spirit even before it was his on paper. I would have been a visitor on my own land." He turned his wine glass slowly. "I needed something that was mine to build, not mine to inherit. And have you found it?" she said. "What you were looking for?" He looked at her across the small table with its guttering candle, and his gray eyes were very direct. "I think I'm close," he said. She held his gaze and did not look away, though something in her chest did something complicated. "Tell me more about Missouri," she said, because she was not yet ready to respond to what he was actually saying, and he was a perceptive enough man to understand that and to let it go, and he told her more about Missouri. She told him about Thomas. She did it deliberately, because she felt that it was something he deserved to know, not as gossip, but as history, the real shape of who she had been before she was who she was now. She told him about meeting Thomas at her father's store in Beaumont, about the way Thomas had been steady and good, and had believed in her ability to run a business before she had fully believed in it herself, about the fever that had come fast and gone faster and left her with a silence in the house that had taken 2 years to learn to inhabit. "I loved him," she said, "not with the kind of love that is all fire and uncertainty, with the kind that is more like foundation, something you stand on." "That's a real kind of love," Joseph said. "It is," she agreed. "And I don't," she paused, "I don't want to replace it. I want something alongside it. Something that acknowledges that it existed and that I am who I am partly because of it." "Yes," he said simply, and she believed that he understood exactly what she meant, which was not something she had expected to find. They drove back to Cassidy Flats in the borrowed wagon under a sky so full of stars that the darkness between them seemed almost incidental. And when he stopped the wagon in front of her bakery and handed her down, and she stood on the boardwalk, and he stood in the street with Captain Tide behind the wagon, he said good night with the same quiet, unhurried manner he brought to everything, and she went inside. And she stood in her kitchen in the dark for a long time with her hand pressed to her sternum, as if she were checking on something. October was clear and cool, and the grasslands turned the color of old honey, and something between Joseph Hadley and Inez Pritchard shifted in the way that things shift in October. Not dramatically, not with a single visible moment of change, but in the accumulation of small things that together amount to something different from what was there before. He began to help her carry the heavy flour sacks from the general store to the bakery on Saturday mornings, not because she had asked him to, but because he had seen her doing it, and it was a heavy job and he had hands. She began to set aside 1 apple turnover on Saturday mornings and mark it with a small piece of paper that said H. And when he came in, he found it waiting at the end of the counter, and neither of them mentioned the system explicitly, but both of them noted it. They went riding on a Sunday afternoon in mid-October, which was Inez's custom when the weather was good, because she kept a horse, a sensible gray mare named Prudence, at Bert Kessler's livery, and she had learned to ride young, and the open land of the Panhandle was one of the things that genuinely restored her. Joseph rode captain, who had long since recovered his shoe and was in excellent temper, and they rode east along Crooked Creek for 2 hours, mostly in companionable silence with occasional conversation. And on the way back, Inez's mare startled at a jackrabbit and danced sideways, and Joseph's hand came out and steadied Prudence's bridle with such immediate, automatic care that Inez looked at him sharply. "She's all right," he said, and he was looking at the mare, but then he looked at Inez, checking, and the look he gave her was the same one he had given the mare, concerned, attentive, calibrated to exactly the degree of reassurance required and not an ounce more. Something cracked open in her chest. She did not show it. She was very good at not showing things. But it was there, sudden and bright and a little frightening, and she carried it home like a bird she wasn't sure she had the right to hold. November brought the first serious cold of the season, and with it a piece of information that Inez learned from Lucy Gable, the seamstress, who learned it from her husband, who had ridden into town from the Barker Ranch and carried the news of it like a stone in his pocket. Sam Barker was selling the east section of his range to a land company out of Dallas. The sale was already arranged. The hands who worked the east section would be let go at the end of the month. Joseph worked the east section. Inez heard this on a Tuesday morning, and she told herself, firmly and immediately, that Joseph Hadley was a capable man who would find work, that it was not her concern in any practical sense, that she should not spend the rest of the morning thinking about it while the bread was rising. She spent the rest of the morning thinking about it while the bread was rising. He came in on Saturday, and he already knew, she could see it in the set of his jaw and the slightly greater quietness than usual, and she poured his coffee and set it in front of him without saying anything, and after a moment he said, "You've heard, I expect." "I have," she said. "I'll find something," he said, and the statement was not self-pity and was not bravado. It was simply an assessment of his own abilities, delivered with a matter-of-factness that she found both admirable and, for the first time, slightly heartbreaking in its solitude. "Gus Henderman over at the Double H has been looking for a ranch foreman since August," she said. "The Henderman Ranch is 6 miles west, which is closer than the Barker. I know Gus reasonably. I could write a word in your favor if you wanted it." He looked at her steadily. "You'd do that?" "Yes," she said. It was not a question and not a performance. She would do it. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see the particular pride of a man who has always solved his own problems having a quiet conversation with itself about whether to accept this. Then he said, "I'd appreciate it." She wrote the letter that afternoon. Gus Henderman hired Joseph as foreman by the end of the following week, at a wage that was better than what Barker had been paying, and the Henderman Ranch was, as she had said, 6 miles west of town. On the Saturday after he started the new position, he came into the bakery, and he was different in some subtle way that she identified after a moment as relief. Not just professional relief, but the deeper relief of a man who has had something important confirmed, which was that the person he had begun to believe was on his side was, in fact, on his side. He sat at his table by the window, and she brought his coffee and his turnover, and he looked up at her and said very simply, "Thank you, Inez." And she said, "Of course," and went back to her counter, and she understood, standing at her counter with her hands flat on its surface, that she was in love with Joseph Hadley. It was not a comfortable understanding. It arrived the way inconvenient truths arrive, fully formed and impatient with protest. She had been keeping careful account of her reactions to him for 7 months, filing them in the back of her mind under categories like noted and appreciated and worth considering. And now they had all rearranged themselves into a single, clear, undeniable category that did not need a label because it had no alternatives. She was in love with him. The difficulty was that she did not know with complete certainty what he intended. She had her strong suspicions. She was not a foolish woman, and she had been paying attention. But she had also been surprised before, not by a man's intentions, but by her own refusal of them. 11 times she had looked at a man who was proposing a version of her life and had found the version wanting. She did not want to find this one wanting. She was afraid, specifically and honestly, of finding this one wanting, because if she turned it away, she did not think she would forgive herself. The last week of November brought a cold snap that frosted the windows of the bakery and turned the water trough outside the livery to a thin skin of ice every morning. Inez was up at 3, as usual, with the stove going full and the dough on its first rise, when she heard a sound outside that she identified after a moment as a horse not passing, but stopping. Then a knock on her back door, which was the door she used herself and which customers never came to. She opened it to find Joseph Hadley standing on her back step with his hat in his hand in snow, which had apparently begun while she had been focused on her dough, catching in his dark hair. His gray eyes were entirely unguarded in a way that she had not seen them before, and she understood immediately that something was wrong. "What is it?" she said, stepping back to let him in. He came inside and she closed the door against the cold, and in the warm light of the kitchen he looked, not devastated, but shaken. He stood for a moment with his hat turning in his hands. "Letter came yesterday," he said. "From Missouri, my younger sister Clara. Her husband died last month. She has 2 small children and she's in a very bad situation. She's written to ask if she could come here." Inez absorbed this. "When would she come?" "She needs to leave Missouri by spring at the latest," he said. "She's at the mercy of her husband's brother right now and He stopped and the stopping told her enough. She needs to come somewhere she's wanted." "Then she should come," Inez said. He looked at her. "I have a room above a saddle shop," he said. "It's not I can't bring her there. I need to find a proper place, a house, somewhere she and the children can be. And I don't," he paused. "I don't have the means to set up a household right now. The Henderman position is good, but I've been sending money back to Missouri all year for my other sister's family." She understood what he was saying. She understood all of it, the practical situation and the deeper thing beneath it, which was a man telling her as clearly as he could where his life stood and what it needed. "Joseph," she said. He looked at her. "Sit down," she said. "Have coffee. Let's talk about this properly." He sat, and she poured, and they talked for an hour. There in her warm kitchen at 4 in the morning, with the bread rising beside the stove and the snow coming down outside. And by the end of the hour there was a general shape to a plan, which involved Joseph speaking to Gus Henderman about the small foreman's house on the Henderman property that had been empty since the last foreman left, and Inez writing a second letter, this one to Clara, to say that her brother was here and that he was surrounded by people who would help. When he left, just before dawn, he paused at the back door and turned back and he said, "I don't deserve the trouble you take over me." "You are not trouble," she said, and meant it so completely that he heard it, and something moved in his eyes that she had not seen before and was not quite ready to name. December in the Texas Panhandle is a particular kind of cold, not the wet, grinding cold of Missouri, Joseph said, but a dry, wind-sharpened cold that finds every gap in a coat and every thin wall of a building and makes itself known. The Henderman foreman's house was a small but solid structure of limestone and cedar, 4 rooms, a good stove, a proper roof, and Gus Henderman, who was a fair man as Inez had said, agreed to add it to Joseph's compensation in lieu of a portion of his wage, which was an arrangement that suited them both. Joseph spent his free Sundays in December making the house ready for Clara's arrival, which was planned for March. He patched the plaster, replaced 2 window panes, repaired the outhouse roof, and cut a considerable quantity of firewood which he stacked against the north wall of the house in the neat, methodical way he approached every physical task. Inez came out on 2 of those Sundays with food on the first, a pot of soup and a loaf of bread. On the second, a pie and a jar of her preserved peaches. And on the second Sunday she stayed to help him clean the windows, because the limestone dust had gotten into everything, and the project was larger than one person. They worked through the afternoon, moving from room to room, And the easy rhythm of working alongside someone who works well was something that Inez had not felt in a long time, and it settled over her like the warmth of the stove in the next room, steady and reliable and real. "I've made this very comfortable," she said, standing in the doorway of the smaller bedroom with her clean rag over her shoulder. "Clara will be glad." "I hope so," he said. He was standing at the window of the larger bedroom, backlit by the winter afternoon light, and he looked at her across the hallway with the quiet directness she had come to know so well. "Inez," he said. "Yes," she said. He seemed to be choosing his words with great care. "I have been thinking about something since last month," he said. "And I have been trying to determine the right way to say it and the right time. And I've concluded that there is probably no perfect right time, and that I should stop waiting for one." She waited. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been, I think, since somewhere around June, though I couldn't have told you that then because it wasn't settled enough in myself to say out loud. It is settled now, very thoroughly." He looked at her steadily. "I am not proposing anything right now. I just needed you to know where I stand so that you have the full information and can make whatever decision you think is right." Inez stood in the doorway of the small bedroom and looked at Joseph Hadley standing in the winter light of his sister's future bedroom, and she felt the great, clean, unambiguous relief of hearing something that confirms what you already knew was true. "I am in love with you too," she said. "Since November or perhaps October, I have been somewhat reluctant to admit it." He let out a slow breath. "Why reluctant?" he asked, and the question was gentle. "Because I have made a habit of not," she said, "of keeping myself at a distance from the possibility, and the habit is hard to break." "I know," he said. He crossed the hallway and stood before her, and she looked up at him, and his expression was so full of something that did not have a single name, careful, tender, serious, and underneath all of it, warm, that she felt it like a physical thing. "We don't have to rush anything," he said. "I meant it when I said I'd be patient." "I know you meant it," she said, "but I'm tired of being patient with myself." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he raised one hand and touched her face, just his fingertips along her cheek, the most careful possible thing, and she did not step back. Christmas came to Cassidy Flats with a modest celebration, as it generally did. The church put up a pine branch and held a service on Christmas Eve, and Jack Halliwell at the Painted Rooster put out a free drink for anyone who wanted one on Christmas night, and the town collected itself for a brief and slightly awkward warmth before dispersing back to its ordinary geography. Inez had never minded Christmas alone. She had the bakery, and the whole town seemed to want her baking more at Christmas than at any other time, and there was something satisfying about being necessary. But this Christmas, she found that the quiet of Christmas afternoon was different, because Joseph rode in from the Henderman Ranch at 3 o'clock with a small wrapped package tucked inside his coat, and they sat at her kitchen table and drank tea, and she opened the package and found inside it a small leather-bound notebook with a tooled cover made, he explained, by Walt Grayson, the saddle maker, who could work leather into almost anything if you gave him a pattern and the time to do it. And the pattern on the cover was a spray of wheat and apple blossoms, because he had thought she might like a place to write down the recipes from her mother's recipe box before the paper got any more fragile. She sat with the notebook in her hands for a moment and did not say anything, because there was nothing adequate to say. He had paid attention to something she had mentioned once, in passing, in September, which was that her mother's recipe box was getting old and some of the cards were fading, and he had held it in his memory for 3 months and made something out of it. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. He had tucked a small sprig of cedar into the wrapping paper, which was already filling her kitchen with the clean, cold smell of the outdoors, and she put the sprig on the windowsill, and she gave him the scarf she had knitted. She was a competent knitter, not inspired, and the scarf was warm and brown and practical, and he put it on immediately without being asked, which made her laugh, and the afternoon fell into the easy shape of two people who are at home with each other. January brought Clara's first letter to Inez, written in response to Inez's December letter. And it was a letter so full of gratitude and a kind of cautious, fragile hope that Inez had to read it twice to take in all of it. Clara was 28 years old. She had 2 children, a boy named Thomas, who was 4, and a girl named Annie, who was 2. And her husband Martin had died of a chest infection in October, leaving behind debts that his brother considered Clara's responsibility to settle through her unpaid labor at the brothers' farm, which was, as Joseph had indicated, a situation that was not safe for Clara or the children. Inez wrote back immediately, offering specific practical information. The house would be ready. The town was small but decent. There was a school. She herself would be glad to have the children in the bakery when Clara needed a hand free. In her letter, without quite intending to, she wrote about Joseph in the way that people write about someone they love when they have dropped their guard in the middle of a practical letter, describing him the way you describe someone whose qualities you cannot help enumerating, warmly and specifically, and with an attention to detail that gives the whole thing away. She did not realize until she had already sealed the letter. She was not entirely sorry. February arrived and brought with it, on its second Saturday, the occasion that became known in the subsequent history of Inez Pritchard and Joseph Hadley as the day that everything tilted on its axis, though in the moment it did not feel dramatic. It felt, as transformative moments often do, slightly absurd. Barlow Kent, who had been the very first of the 11, came into the bakery on that February Saturday with a new suit and a freshly barbered appearance, and a look on his face that told Inez, before he opened his mouth, exactly what was coming. He had heard about Joseph. The whole town had heard about Joseph, but Barlow was a man who believed that persistence was its own argument, and he had decided, for reasons that were not entirely clear to Inez, that the situation had changed sufficiently to warrant a 12th attempt. He stood at her counter and he said, in the formal, prepared manner of a man who has rehearsed this in front of a mirror, "Inez, I have long admired you. You are a fine woman and a fine businesswoman, and I believe we could make a good life together, and I am asking you to be my wife." It was not a bad proposal, as proposals went. It was clear and sincere and free of the more egregious qualities that had afflicted some of its predecessors. It was, by the standard of the 11 that had come before it, a reasonable proposal, and Inez Pritchard laughed. She did not mean to. She had not planned to. It rose up out of her the way laughter rises up out of a person when something strikes them at exactly the angle that bypasses all the careful filters of politeness, sudden and genuine, and impossible to hold back. It was not unkind, because Inez's laugh was never unkind, but it was completely, helplessly real, and it lasted just long enough for Barlow's face to go through several distinct stages before settling on a kind of resigned dignity. The door of the bakery opened at the tail end of her laughter, because the bell above it had very poor timing, and Joseph Hadley walked in from the cold street and took in the scene, Barlow Kent at the counter looking as though he had just been told very certain news, and Inez with her hand over her mouth and her eyes very bright, with the speed of a man who has learned to read a room quickly. "Should I come back?" he said. "No," Inez said. She dropped her hand from her mouth and the laughter was gone, but the brightness in her eyes was not. She looked at Barlow. "I'm sorry, Barlow, truly, but no. The answer is no." Barlow nodded, with the dignity of a man accepting a verdict he had half expected, and picked up his hat and left, and the bell above the door rang again. Joseph stood in the middle of the bakery and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she could not quite identify, a kind of careful stillness, and beneath it something she thought might be apprehension. "He proposed," she said. "I gathered," Joseph said. "He is the 12th person to do so," she said. "In 7 years." "Is that so?" he said. "It is. I have laughed at most of them." She looked at him steadily. "I have not laughed at you. I want you to know that. Whatever you may be thinking about saying next, I want you to know that first." He crossed the room to her counter and he stood on the customer side of it and looked at her across the narrow distance of the counter's width, and he said, I know you haven't laughed at me, Inez. I've been paying attention." He paused. "I was going to wait until spring. Until Clara was settled and the house was properly arranged and things were less complicated. But I find I don't want to wait until spring." She waited. "I love you," he said. "You know that. And I want to be with you, not in the complicated, eventually way, but now, or as near to now as we can arrange. I want to marry you." He said it as simply and as directly as he said everything, and Inez Pritchard, who had laughed at every man who had stood in her bakery or on her porch or at the county fair or in the middle of the Painted Rooster, and asked her that same fundamental question, felt something move through her chest and dissolve like sugar in warm water. She laughed. It came out of her before she could stop it, and it was a different laugh from Barlow Kent's laugh, a different laugh from all 11 of the preceding laughs, because it was full of warmth and something that was almost disbelief. Not in him, but in herself, in the fact of standing here in her bakery in February with flour on her apron, and this man across her counter looking at her with those calm gray eyes, and feeling for the first time in 7 years like the answer to the question was not no. She laughed, and he watched her with a careful, slightly arrested expression, and she was still laughing when she said, "Yes." He blinked. "Yes." "Yes," she said again, and the laughter was fading into something warmer and steadier. "Yes, Joseph, yes." He was very still for a moment, as if making certain he had heard correctly. Then he came around the counter, and she came around the counter toward him, and they met in the middle. And his hands were on her face with the same care as December's touch, but more certain now. And she was looking up at him, and he was looking down at her. And he kissed her carefully at first, and then not carefully at all. And the bakery smelled of warm bread and cinnamon and the cold outdoor smell of his coat. And it was completely and entirely everything. "You laughed," he said, a moment later. "I did," she agreed, still close to him. "You said yes," he said. "I did," she agreed again. "Before you stopped laughing," he noted. She pulled back just far enough to look at him. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said, and the smile that changed the whole geography of his face arrived, complete and full and devastating. "It's the best possible thing." Word of Inez Pritchard's acceptance of Joseph Hadley's proposal spread through Cassidy Flats in the way that significant news spreads through a small town. By the end of the day, via a chain of perfectly ordinary conversations, every person within the town's geography was aware of it, and the general response was a particular kind of satisfaction, which is the satisfaction a community feels when something has gone right, even if the community had nothing to do with it. Barlow Kent bore the news with equanimity. He had known, he said when she laughed. The laugh this time had been different, and he was a man who had heard Inez Pritchard's laugh enough times to know when it meant no and when it meant something else. Lucy Gable immediately began thinking about what she could sew for the occasion. Jack Halliwell said that drinks were on him for an hour when it was official. Bert Kessler said nothing, but was observed to be considerably more cheerful than usual for several days. The spring came the way spring comes in the Panhandle, not gently, but with a kind of muscular inevitability, pushing the cold back and turning the grass from brown to a tentative green and filling Crooked Creek, with the runoff from the hills to the north. Clara Hadley arrived at the beginning of March on the eastbound stage from Amarillo, which was the nearest rail connection, with her 2 children and 3 traveling trunks, and the look of a woman who has been holding herself together through an act of will for several months, and is only now allowing the will to relax a little. She was smaller than Joseph, with the same dark hair but softer eyes, and when she saw her brother on the platform of the Amarillo stage stop where he had driven to meet her, she pressed her face into his shoulder for a long moment, and he held her with the solid, uncomplicated steadiness that was the most fundamental thing about him. Then she looked at Inez, who had come along to help with the children on the drive back, and she said, with the directness that apparently ran in the family, "You are exactly what his letters describe, and I am very glad you are going to marry him." Inez, who had not known Joseph wrote letters of that kind, felt her heart do something she was learning to allow. "I'm glad you're here," she said, and meant it. The children, Thomas, who was solemn and brown-haired and clearly already idolizing his uncle, and Annie, who was tiny and round-faced and fearless, installed themselves in the foreman's house with the adaptability of small children, which is to say instantly and completely. And by the end of the first week, Thomas had discovered the location of every cat on the Henderman property, and Annie had learned to say, "Miss Inez," in a tone that Inez found, against her better judgment, completely irresistible. The question of the bakery was one that Inez had been turning over for some time. She had built it from nothing over 7 years, and it was hers in a way that went beyond property. It was the proof of what she had been capable of alone, and she was not interested in giving it up. She had spoken of this to Joseph on a February evening, carefully, expecting to have to argue for it. He had looked at her as if she had proposed something mildly surprising and said, "Of course you keep the bakery. Why would you do anything else?" She had looked at him for a moment. "Some men would consider it complicated." "I'm not some men," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, only a statement of clear fact. The question became, then, not whether she would keep the bakery but how to manage the practical geography of their life together. Whether to live at the Henderman foreman's house, which was Joseph's professional accommodation, or to live at the bakery building, which had a full living space above the shop and which was, by any measure, Inez's. They discussed this over several evenings in March, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, and the children's voices drifting occasionally through the wall from the next room where Clara was putting them to bed. And the solution they arrived at was both practical and, in its way, characteristic of both of them. Gus Henderman had already indicated that the new foreman's house arrangement was working well, and he saw no reason to change it. But Inez's building had more space and was in town, and for the bakery to function well, it needed someone living in it to manage the pre-dawn hours. They would live above the bakery. Joseph would ride out to the Henderman ranch each morning and return each evening, which was not an inconvenient journey, and which was, in fact, a shorter commute than many men managed on the range. The wedding was set for the 3rd Saturday of April, 1 year nearly to the day since Joseph Hadley had walked up the main street of Cassidy Flats with his saddlebag over his shoulder and nearly run into a woman hanging a sign. Reverend James Cook, who had replaced the circuit preacher Roy Alderman, and who was a considerably more capable pastor, agreed to perform the ceremony in the small church with the northward-leaning steeple. Lucy Gable made Inez a dress of a deep blue-gray wool that was practical enough to be worn again and beautiful enough for the occasion. Inez had specified both requirements, and Lucy had met them with the precision of a woman who understood the difference between what her clients said they wanted and what they actually needed, and in this case, they were the same thing. The Saturday arrived with a high blue sky and a south wind and a warmth that was exactly what April owed the Panhandle after the winter it had delivered. The whole town of Cassidy Flats was at the church. Bert Kessler sat in the back with his hat on his knee and a smile that he would have denied. Barlow Kent sat in the middle and was gracious about it in the way that a man can be gracious when he understands that something was never really his to lose. Gus Henderman and his wife sat near the front with Clara and the children, and Annie, in a state of high excitement about the dress she had been allowed to wear, had already eaten the flour from her own hair and was working on Thomas's. Joseph stood at the front of the church and watched Inez come down the aisle with the full, unguarded attention of a man who has spent months being patient, and who is now watching the end of patience arrive, and his face held something that had no performance in it at all, just genuine, clear, complete gladness. She came to stand beside him, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and Reverend Cook began the words, and they said them back, clearly, steadily, with the particular gravity that real promises carry when they are made by people who understand the weight of them. When it was done and it was settled, and Reverend Cook was smiling, and the church was applauding, and Annie was saying, "Miss Inez, Miss Inez," from somewhere near the second pew, Joseph Hadley put his hands on either side of his wife's face and kissed her, and Inez Hadley now kissed him back with the full, unself-conscious warmth of a woman who has decided to stop holding back and intends to make the decision permanent. Jack Halliwell had been as good as his word. The hour of complimentary drinks at the Painted Rooster stretched into something considerably longer as the afternoon progressed, and the fiddle player arrived, and the tables were pushed back against the walls, and the celebration went on until the stars were thick overhead, and the night had gone fully cool, and Clara had taken the children home, and Joseph and Inez were the last ones on the floor for a slow, lazy final song. Turning in small circles in the middle of the Painted Rooster's scarred floor with her head against his shoulder and his hand at the small of her back, and neither of them was in any hurry. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly in the vicinity of her hair. "Yes," she said. It was the most straightforward answer she had given to anything in a long time, and its straightforwardness felt like a kind of freedom. The first year of their marriage arranged itself around them with the naturalness of things that are well-fitted. Joseph rose before dawn to see Inez through the first stage of the baking. He had learned, over months, to be useful in the kitchen in the specific ways that she needed rather than the ways he assumed, which was a distinction she appreciated enormously, and then rode out to the Henderman Ranch while she opened the bakery. He was back by evening and they ate supper together, often with Clara and the children who came in from the foreman's house 3 or 4 times a week, and the evenings were full of the ordinary, particular warmth of a household that is functioning and loving, and not performing either quality for anyone's benefit. Clara had found work at the Marvel School by September, teaching the younger children, which was work that suited her, and which gave her an independence that she was building carefully, week by week, out of the rubble of what her marriage had left her. Thomas had started school in Cassidy Flats with an aptitude for arithmetic that impressed his teacher, and Annie had become, as Inez had predicted, a fixture in the bakery whenever she was allowed, conducting herself among the flour sacks and cooling racks with the authority of a 2-year-old who has identified her territory. Inez found that marriage to Joseph was very different from what she had imagined marriage might be, and not in the way she had feared. She had worried, somewhere beneath the surface of her certainty about him, that the daily reality of a shared life would reduce the specific quality that made him himself, the directness, the calm, the unhurried attentiveness. Instead, those qualities amplified, because they were no longer modulated by the caution of courtship. He disagreed with her about things and said so clearly, without meanness, and she disagreed with him about things and said so with the directness she had learned to trust in herself, and they figured out the disagreements in the way you figure out a complicated puzzle, not by forcing pieces together, but by finding the arrangement that is actually correct. The winter of 1879 came in more gently than the previous one, and by February Inez had calculated, with the precision of a woman who has been managing her own body's schedule for many years, that she was expecting a child. She told Joseph on a Tuesday evening when the bakery was closed and the house was quiet and they were sitting by the stove in the front room, and she told him the way she told him everything, directly and without ceremony. He sat very still for a moment, and then he looked at her with an expression that was so completely unguarded and so full of something large and warm that she felt tears come to her own eyes, which surprised her because she had planned to be entirely composed about the whole thing. "Are you well?" he asked, moving to her immediately, his hand finding hers. "Very well," she said, "completely well." He held her hand in both of his for a moment, and she could feel him recalibrating the world around this information, which was something she had seen him do before, the quiet, internal adjustment of a man who takes seriously whatever is in front of him. Then he looked at her and said, "Thank you," and she knew he didn't mean for telling him, he meant for the whole enormous fact of it. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "There is a considerable amount of work between here and the result." "I know," he said and squeezed her hands. "I'll be here for all of it," he was. The spring brought Clara's announcement that she had been asked by the school board in Marville to take a full position starting in the fall, which would require her to move closer to Marville, and which she wanted to do and was slightly anxious about, for all the reasons that a widow with 2 small children is anxious about large changes even when the changes are good ones. Inez and Joseph helped her negotiate the practical details, finding a boarding arrangement in Marville that was respectable and within her wage, ensuring Thomas would transfer to the Marville school without difficulty, making arrangements for the foreman's house to be vacated properly and in good standing with Gus Henderman. On the day Clara and the children left for Marville in a wagon that Gus Henderman had loaned for the occasion, Annie sat at the back of the wagon and waved at Inez until the wagon turned the bend in the road and disappeared, and Inez stood on the main street of Cassidy Flats and felt the particular bittersweet quality of watching someone you love go towards something good. "She'll be all right," Joseph said beside her. "I know," Inez said. "She's a Hadley." She looked up at him. "They tend to be resilient." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood there while the dust settled where the wagon had been. The summer moved with the warmth and the weight of late pregnancy, and Inez managed the bakery through July by reducing her hours and enlisting the help of Nell Grayson, Walt's 17-year-old daughter, who turned out to have an instinct for pastry that Inez recognized immediately and began developing with the same practical care with which she did everything. Nell was a quick learner, and by August the bakery was running on a modified schedule that Inez had planned with characteristic precision, and she was spending the hottest part of the afternoons off her feet, which was Joseph's primary and frequently expressed requirement. On the 14th of August, 1879, a Tuesday, their son arrived. He was loud and robust and immediately opinionated about the temperature of the room, a quality which was, as Joseph observed mildly, possibly hereditary from more than one direction. They named him Samuel Thomas Hadley Samuel for Gus Henderman's reliable decency, which had made everything possible, and Thomas for Inez's first husband, because she had decided early that she was not a woman who buried her history, and because Joseph had agreed without hesitation when she brought it up, which was one of the 1,000 reasons she loved him. Sam, as he was immediately called, was a large, healthy baby who ate with the dedication of a professional and slept, unfortunately, with the irregularity of someone who had not yet grasped the social contract of nighttime. He was dark-haired like his father and had his mother's wide, expressive mouth, and he was, from the first day, the center of gravity of the household in a way that was complete and exhausting and entirely wonderful. Joseph proved, in those early months, to be exactly the kind of father Inez had suspected he would be, present in a way that was not performance, hands-on without requiring direction, and possessed of a patience with a small person's needs that was bottomless. He managed the pre-dawn hours with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, so that Inez could sleep the additional hours she needed, and in exchange, she managed the later mornings, and the arrangement was never articulated as an arrangement, but simply became the shape of their days. Clara rode back to Cassidy Flats with Thomas and Annie to meet Sam in September, when the weather had cooled and the roads were better, and Annie's reaction to the baby was so full of proprietary enthusiasm that Joseph had to gently negotiate the terms of her access. Thomas, solemn as always, looked at Sam for a long time and then said, "He's very little," with the particular gravity of a 5-year-old assessing something unfamiliar, and then asked if he could hold him, and when he did he sat very carefully and very still with the baby in his arms, and looked up at Inez with an expression so like his uncle's that her heart ached with a pleasant ache. The county had been changing since Joseph's arrival, in the way the whole of Texas was changing in the late 1870s. The open range was beginning to close, barbed wire appearing on fence lines that had previously been marked only by post and imagination, and the cattle drives north were becoming less reliable as Kansas markets shifted and the railroad moved. These changes affected everyone in the county, and Cassidy Flats debated them with the intensity that small communities bring to large forces they cannot quite control. Joseph's perspective on these changes was, as always, more complicated than the average rancher's, because he held in his head simultaneously the practical reality of the cattle business and the broader ethical question of what the enclosure of the land meant for the people who had lived on it before the ranchers arrived. He said this at a town meeting in October of 1879, clearly and without apology, and while it did not make him universally beloved, it earned him a particular kind of respect from the men who had been thinking the same thing and had not said it, which was perhaps more valuable. Inez, who was at the meeting and who had her own views, expressed them afterward at the kitchen table with the directness that had always been hers, and they talked until past midnight about things that were real and large and not entirely solvable. And she thought, not for the first time, that this was one of the specific gifts of the life they had built together, that it was full of actual conversation. By the spring of 1880, the bakery had expanded in the most practical sense. Inez had taken on the adjacent storage room, negotiated a reasonable lease from the building's owner with a view to eventual purchase, and converted it into a second working space that allowed the bakery to supply 2 of the ranch households to the north with weekly bread orders. Nell Grayson had become a proper apprentice, with a wage, and was developing the particular pride of a person who has discovered what they are good at. The business was thriving in the specific way that good businesses thrive when they are founded on quality, and run by someone who understands that quality is a discipline rather than a gift. Sam was growing at a pace that seemed to Inez, who had baked bread for 15 years and understood the patience required for rise, to be somewhat overly ambitious. He was walking by the time he was 11 months old and talking by 14 months, partial words that were nevertheless clearly purposeful, and by the spring of 1880, he was a sturdy, observant 20-month-old who had begun accompanying his father on the very short walk from the house above the bakery to the livery each morning, holding Joseph's hand with the total concentration of a small person who has made this journey important. One morning in April, the 2nd anniversary, very nearly, of Joseph's arrival in Cassidy Flats, Inez stood at her bakery window with her coffee and watched the 2 of them go up the street in the early morning light, Sam in his small coat taking 3 steps to every one of Joseph's, and Joseph walking at Sam's pace without any visible awareness of having adjusted himself, talking to the boy in a low, easy conversation that Sam was responding to with great seriousness. She had laughed at 11 men and said no 11 times, and she had been right 11 times, and she had laughed at the 12th man before she said yes, and she had been right then too, in a way she hadn't been expecting and would not have predicted, and was not, even now, entirely done being grateful for. The morning light made the street gold and the air smelled of spring grass, and the bread was already baked and sitting on the cooling rack behind her, and in an hour the town would be up and she would open the door and the day would begin. But for this moment she stood at the window and watched her husband and her son walk up the street in the early light, and she felt the happiness settle over her like something she had not known she was waiting for until it arrived. Nell came in through the back at 6, tying her apron and asking about the rye loaves, and Inez turned from the window and went back to work, and the bakery filled with its morning warmth, and the first customers came at 7, and the day opened up around her with all its ordinary, beautiful, irreplaceable particulars. By the following autumn, Inez confirmed what she had suspected since July, which was that Sam was going to have company. This time she and Joseph had the conversation over supper with Sam in his high chair between them, which gave it a considerably more chaotic quality than the previous announcement, but also, she thought, a truer one. This was their life, full and sometimes noisy and never entirely planned. Again, Joseph said with the smile that still, 3 years in, had the ability to change everything. Again, she confirmed. Sam, who had not followed the conversation, offered his father a piece of bread crust in what appeared to be a gesture of solidarity, and Joseph accepted it with the gravity the situation deserved. Clara had, by the fall of 1880, settled so thoroughly into her life in Marville that it had become clearly and genuinely hers. She wrote every week long letters full of the children's developments, and the school's small dramas and occasional news of a widower named Henry Alcott, who taught the older children, and who appeared in her letters with increasing frequency and decreasing casualness. Inez read these letters with the attention of a woman who recognized the symptoms, and replied with the warmth of someone who wants very much for a person she loves to have what they deserve. When Clara came for Christmas of 1880, and Henry Alcott's name came up twice in the first hour of her visit, Inez said nothing, but exchanged a look with Joseph that contained a complete and mutually understood conversation. In March of 1881, their daughter was born, a small, fierce girl who arrived on a Sunday morning and immediately demonstrated, in the opinion of everyone present, a personality of considerable force. They named her Margaret after Inez's mother. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's dark auburn hair and absolutely no patience for being kept waiting, which was, as the household quickly established, simply a quality you planned around. Joseph held Maggie in the crook of his arm on the first evening of her life, and looked at her with an expression that was the same expression he had worn when Sam was first placed in his arms, total, speechless, unguarded wonder. And Inez, watching from the bed, thought that there was no sight in the world quite like a strong, capable, good man entirely undone by something small enough to hold in one hand. Sam, who was 20 months old and had been prepared for a sibling by a series of conversations whose success was hard to measure, regarded his sister with the solemn assessment that was characteristic of him, and then said "baby" with great certainty, and having thus classified the situation, went back to his truck, which was a carved wooden thing that Joseph had made him for Christmas. The spring of 1881 spread over the Panhandle with its usual muscular abundance, and Cassidy Flats moved through it in the way that towns move through springs that have been survived, with the particular relief of people who have made it through another winter, and are prepared to believe, however provisionally, that things might be all right. Gus Henderman told Joseph in April that he intended to expand the Henderman operation by buying the adjacent property to the west, and that he wanted Joseph to take on a greater operational role in managing both sections, with a commensurate increase in his wage. It was recognition of what Joseph had built over 3 years, and it was also, incidentally, the point at which they could begin thinking seriously about the purchase of a property of their own, not immediately, but as a realistic horizon. Inez, who had been quietly managing the bakery's finances with the precision she brought to everything, had her own numbers, and when she and Joseph sat down one evening with the children asleep and Clara's most recent letter on the table between them, they did the arithmetic together and arrived at the same conclusion from different starting points, which was that within 5 years they could own something outright. Land perhaps, or the expanded bakery building, or a house with enough land to keep a kitchen garden and a few chickens, and eventually, if things continued, a proper small holding. "What do you want?" he asked her, meaning it as a serious question. She considered it seriously. "I want to own the bakery building," she said, "and I want a proper kitchen garden, and I want the children to go to school and come home to a table that has enough on it." She paused. "What do you want?" "I want to stay here," he said simply. "With you. I want to build something that Sam and Maggie grow up knowing is theirs." He looked around at the kitchen with its good stove, and the dried herbs on their hooks, and the recipe box on its shelf with the new recipes that Inez had been adding to her mother's handwriting in her own clear hand. "This is what I came west to find. I didn't know that when I left Missouri, but this is what it was." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm up and held it. Outside, the Texas night was enormous and full of stars, the way it always was, and Cassidy Flats was sleeping in its particular way, and Crooked Creek was running with the spring water, and the church steeple was still leaning north, and the whole known geography of their life was arranged around them in the dark. "We're going to be all right," she said. "Yes," he said, "we are." In June, a letter arrived from Clara saying that Henry Alcott had asked her to marry him and she had said yes, and could everyone please come to Marville in September for a small wedding, and please tell Inez to bring the apple turnovers because Henry had heard about them and she had promised them, which Inez read aloud to Joseph at the breakfast table and which made them both laugh. They went to Marville in September, all four of them, Joseph and Inez and Sam, who was 2.5 and had opinions about wagon rides, and Maggie, who was 6 months old and had opinions about everything. And Clara married Henry Alcott in the Marville church on a clear September morning, and Thomas and Annie stood up very straight in their good clothes, and Inez brought 3 dozen apple turnovers, and they were gone within the first 20 minutes of the reception, which she took as the appropriate compliment. Watching her sister-in-law marry, Inez thought about the 7 years and the 11 proposals and the laugh that had been, in its way, not a weapon or a defense, but simply the sound of a woman who knew her own mind. And then the 12th, and the laugh that had been different, and the yes that had followed it before she had quite finished, and everything that had grown from that yes in the 3 years since. Joseph, standing beside her with Maggie against his chest, looked down at her and read something in her expression with the ease of a man who has been paying attention for 3 years, and he said quietly, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said, "that you came through my door on a Wednesday in April and I nearly walked straight into you, and I don't believe in fate as a rule, but I am willing to make an exception." He looked at her with those gray eyes that were so thoroughly known to her now, every variation of them, every shade and quality, and he said, "I'm glad you ran a bakery." "I'm glad Captain threw a shoe," she said. He laughed, and his laugh, which she had been collecting for 3 years, was still one of the best sounds she knew. Maggie startled and then settled, and Sam, who was sitting on the floor with Thomas in a state of deep mutual regard, looked up to see what the noise was and then went back to his own important business. The September day was golden around them, warm with the last of summer's heat and touched at the edges with the beginning of autumn's cool, and the music was starting at the front of the reception hall, and Clara was laughing at something Henry had said with the full, unguarded laugh of a woman who has been afraid for a long time and has decided to stop, and Inez watched her and felt the particular joy that is about someone else's happiness and is therefore completely clean. Joseph's hand found hers, and she folded her fingers through his, and the music played, and the afternoon continued to be beautiful in the way that real things are beautiful without performance, without the need for anything to be different from what it was. The years that followed were the years of accumulation, the years of building the ordinary and irreplaceable architecture of a life. By 1883, they had purchased the bakery building outright, and the sense of ownership, not tenuous, not borrowed, but real and documented, was something that Inez felt every morning when she came downstairs in the early dark and began the work that was entirely hers. Nell Grayson had become, by that point, a full partner in the operation, with a share of the profits and her name on the door alongside Inez's, and the bakery had grown from a single-woman operation to a genuine business that supplied bread to half the county and pastries to every significant occasion from Cassidy Flats to Marville. Joseph had taken on, by 1883, a stake in the Henderman operation, not a majority share, but a genuine investment, earned and recognized, that made him a partner in the enterprise he had been managing for 5 years. Cassidy Flats knew his name the way a town knows the name of a man who has stayed and built and contributed, which was a different and more substantial knowing than reputation. Sam started school in the fall of 1883, walking up the main street of Cassidy Flats on the first morning with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and the particular seriousness of a child who has decided to take this thing seriously. And Inez watched him go from the bakery doorway and did not cry, which was a considerable effort. And Joseph, who had ridden in from the Henderman Ranch specifically for the occasion, stood beside her and was generous enough not to mention that her hands were pressed together in front of her with unnecessary force. "He'll be fine," Joseph said. "I know," Inez said. "I'm not worried." "You are," he said gently. "I am," she admitted. "But I'm also proud." Both things at once. Yes, he said. He knew about both things at once. He was, as she had told him once, a complicated man. Maggie, who was 2.5 and had been incensed at being left home when Sam went to school, had redirected her considerable energy into the bakery's operations, where she had developed a specific and passionate interest in the apple turnovers, particularly in the eating of them. Inez was not particularly surprised. The apple turnovers had, she had come to believe, a significance in the history of her life that was entirely disproportionate to their ingredients. Clara had 2 children with Henry Alcott by 1883, a boy named James and an infant daughter whose name had not yet settled. And Thomas, who was 9 and developing into a thoughtful, mathematical, careful person, who was undeniably his mother's child and his uncle's nephew, wrote Joseph long letters about things he was learning in school, and Joseph wrote back, every one in full. The letter writing was one of the specific things Inez loved about him. He was not, by nature, a man of many words, but the words he chose were real ones, and he treated the obligation of a letter as a genuine obligation, something owed to the person on the other end, who deserved the effort of a real response. She had told him this once, and he had looked at her with mild surprise, as if it had not occurred to him that this was notable, and she had thought that this was one of the fundamental qualities that made him who he was. He did not know he was good because being good was simply what he did. The way breathing was what he did. In the late summer of 1884, when Sam was 4 and Maggie was 3, and the bakery was thriving, and the Henderman operation was the most successful cattle ranch in the county, and Joseph and Inez had been married 6 years. They sat on the porch of the building above the bakery on a warm August evening with the panhandle spread out before them in the long, amber, horizontal light of the hour before dark. And Sam was asleep inside, and Maggie was very nearly asleep on Inez's lap. And Joseph had his boots off and his chair tilted back and his coffee cooling on the railing, and there was nothing particular to say, and so they didn't say it. The town was settling into its evening. The painted rooster was sending fiddle music up the street. The church steeple was still leaning north, and someone, it might have been Walt Grayson, had finally gotten around to straightening it earlier in the year, but it had leaned back again by spring, which everyone agreed was simply its nature. Crooked Creek was low in August but still running, a silver thread at the edge of hearing if the wind was right. The stars were beginning to appear, one at a time, in the deep blue above the horizon. Inez had her hand in Joseph's, the way she often did in the evenings. His thumb was moving in a slow, absent circle against her palm, the way it did when he was comfortable and not thinking about it, and she felt the warmth of the evening and the weight of the child on her lap, and the familiar presence of the man beside her, and the full, complete, entirely closed circle of everything that had brought them here. "Joseph," she said. He said, not quite asleep. "I want you to know something." He turned his head to look at her in the amber light. "I am very glad," she said, "that I laughed before I said yes, because the yes would have been the same regardless, but the laugh meant it was real. Does that make sense?" He looked at her for a long moment, and the smile arrived, that same smile, the one she had been collecting for 6 years, still as complete and devastating as the first time. "Yes," he said, "it makes perfect sense." Maggie shifted on her lap and made a small noise of protest at being half-woken, and Inez adjusted her without thinking. the practiced ease of a woman who has held a small person through the transition between sleep and more sleep. And Maggie subsided, and the evening continued, warm and still and full of the ordinary miracle of a life that is exactly what it is supposed to be. The fiddle music from the painted rooster drifted up the street, and the stars came out in their abundance, and the Texas night settled over Cassidy Flats with the particular permanence of things that have been here for a very long time. And Inez Pritchard Hadley, who had laughed at 11 men and laughed at the 12th before she said yes to him, sat on her porch above her bakery in the town that was hers, with her children asleep and her husband beside her, and felt the full weight of happiness. Not the weightless kind that lifts you off the ground and leaves you uncertain, but the real kind, the kind that settles you into yourself like good bread into a loaf pan, warm and shaped and solid and complete. She squeezed Joseph's hand. He squeezed back. The night was long and warm and entirely theirs.